The California sun was finally beginning to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. But at the Thorne estate, the day was just getting started. Lights, hundreds of them, began to flicker on. They twinkled in the olive trees lining the driveway, glowed from under the clear blue water of the infinity pool, and blazed from every window of the massive modern house. It looked less like a home and more like a spaceship that had landed gracefully on the perfectly manicured lawn. Inside, a quiet army was at work. A team of caterers in sharp black uniforms moved with silent precision. They placed tiny, exquisite food on sparkling platter-seared scallops, no bigger than a coin, miniature beef Wellingtons, spoons holding a single perfect oyster. Florists put the last touches on arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air smelled like gardenias, expensive perfume, and ambition. This was Damien Thorne's world. And tonight, he was showing it off. Damien stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sunset. He was a man who looked the part. Mid-40s, with hair that was just silver enough to look distinguished, not old. His suit was dark, expensive, and fit him like a second skin. He didn't smile much, but he had a way of looking at things, people, art, a business deal, as if he was calculating their exact value. He'd made his first million in tech before he was 30, not by being the smartest coder, but by seeing what people wanted before they knew it themselves. Now, he invested in everything from apps to apartment buildings. The party tonight was for him, of course, but it was also for the people he wanted to impress, or, in some cases, remind of his success. The guests started to arrive. The quiet of the house was swallowed by a wave of chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Men in sleek suits and women in dresses that seemed to be made of liquid silk filled the rooms. The conversations were a low hum of big words: market volatility, Series B funding, curating an experience. Everyone was someone, or at least they were very good at pretending to be. Among the glittering crowd, another group moved. They wore simple, crisp white shirts and black trousers or skirts. They were the waitstaff. Their job was to be invisible, to glide through the room, offer a drink, clear a plate, and disappear without a sound. They were scenery. Most of the guests looked right through them. One of them was a woman we'll call Lena. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat, practical bun. She had a quiet face, but her eyes were watchful and intelligent. She noticed which guest was left out of a conversation, which older man was looking for a place to sit, which woman's glass had been empty for too long. She moved smoothly, balancing a heavy tray of champagne flutes as if they were weightless. Lena needed this job. Really needed it. The pay for a single night at an event like this was more than she made in 3 long shifts at the diner where she usually worked. The diner was all grease smells and loud families and coffee that never stopped brewing. This world, the Thorne's world, was cold and beautiful and silent in a different way. She was here for the money, period. A stack of bills was waiting to be paid, and this night would cover them. As she offered a tray to a group of laughing men. One of them took a glass without even glancing at her. His eyes were fixed on a famous actress across the room. Lena didn't mind. Invisibility was part of the job, but someone did see her. Damien Thorne was making his rounds, playing the gracious host. He shook hands, clapped shoulders, told a short, polished joke that made a small circle of people laugh on cue. His eyes swept the room, checking the social temperature of his party. And that's when he saw her. At first, it was just another server. Then something clicked. The profile of her face, the way she held herself, there was a ghost of familiarity. He watched her for a moment longer as she turned, and a memory, old and dusty, slid into place. It wasn't from the diner. He'd never been to the diner. It was from a different life, a different time. Over a decade ago, Damien had spent a single semester at the renowned Lawrence Music Academy. He hadn't gone to play. He'd gone because his father believed a well-rounded man needed to rub shoulders with artists and intellectuals, and because the children of very wealthy families went there. He'd taken a basic music theory class, found it boring, and spent most of his time in the back, making connections that would later prove useful. And there had been a girl, a scholarship student. She was talked about even among the rich kids and the snobby professors. A prodigy from a nowhere town, they said. Her hands were magic on the keys. He remembered seeing her once at a student recital. She'd played something complicated and sad, and for a few minutes, even he had been quieted. He'd forgotten her name instantly. She was part of the scenery there, too, just a different kind. The talented but poor scenery that made the school look good. And now here she was, in his house, clearing his guests' half-eaten canapes. A slow, cold smile spread across Damien's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found a way to prove a point he'd always believed. That talent without money, without the right connections, was a party trick. It was worthless. Her presence here, in a uniform, confirmed everything he thought about the real world. He felt a thrill. This was better than any business deal tonight. This was a live demonstration. He could use her to entertain his guests, true, but more importantly, he could use her to show everyone the natural order of things. The star student was now serving drinks. The punchline was too perfect to ignore. He waited for the right moment. The party was at its peak. People were loosened up by good wine and their own importance. He moved to a spot near the grand piano, a stunning, glossy black monster that cost more than a luxury car. It was mostly for show. A professional pianist had played earlier during cocktails. He picked up a small silver fork and tapped it gently against his crystal champagne flute. Ting, ting. The conversations dipped, then faded. All eyes turned to him. He loved this feeling. Friends, thank you all for coming, he began, his voice practiced and warm. I'm so glad you're enjoying yourselves. He paused, letting his gaze travel over the crowd. Then he let it land, with deliberate purpose, on Lena, who was near the patio doors, holding her tray. You know, he continued, his tone shifting to one of playful discovery. Life has a funny way of bringing the past back to us. I believe we have a hidden treasure in our midst tonight. Lena felt a prickle on the back of her neck. She kept her eyes down, hoping, praying the spotlight was moving elsewhere. This young lady, Damien said, gesturing broadly towards her. She's not just an excellent member of our staff tonight. No, our paths crossed years ago at the Lawrence Academy. She was quite the star there. A real pianist. Isn't that right? The entire party's attention swung to Lena. She felt the weight of 100 eyes. Her face grew warm. She knew what he was doing. She'd seen this kind of thing before from people who enjoyed holding all the cards. Damien walked a few steps toward her, his smile widening. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Come on, don't be shy. We would be honored. He turned back to the guests. Wouldn't we? A private concert from a former prodigy? Let's give her a little encouragement. Polite, curious applause rippled through the room. They were on his side. This was his house, his party, his game. They were eager to be entertained. Lena stood perfectly still. The tray in her hands felt suddenly very heavy. Her mind raced. She could make an excuse. She could say she didn't remember, that he was mistaken. She could just walk away. But she needed the money. If she caused a scene, she might not get paid. She might even be thrown out. She looked at Damien's face. She saw the triumph there. He was waiting for her to squirm, to stutter, to fail. He was so sure of what came next. In that moment, a strange calm settled over her. The noise of the party seemed to fade. The heat in her cheeks cooled. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about something else. This was about a man who thought he could buy a moment of humiliation, not very slowly. Without saying a word, Lena bent her knees and placed the heavy tray of empty glasses on a low, sturdy table. She stood up straight. She smoothed the front of her simple white shirt with her palms. Then she turned. She did not look at Damien. She did not look at the smirking guests. She looked straight ahead at the giant, glossy black piano sitting silently in the corner, and she began to walk towards it. The walk to the piano felt like a mile. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Every eye was fixed on her. She could hear the soft rustle of silk, the faint clink of a bracelet, the slow, steady click of her own sensible shoes on the polished floor. The air, which had smelled of perfume and flowers, now felt charged. Like before a storm dot, she kept her gaze forward. She didn't look at the wealthy man standing by the piano, his expression a mixture of smugness and curiosity. She didn't look at the guests, whose faces were a blur of anticipation. She focused on the instrument. It was a beautiful Steinway, the kind she hadn't touched in years. Its black surface was like a dark lake, reflecting the shimmering lights of the chandelier above. Inside, her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. A voice in her head screamed that this was a trap, that she should turn around, make an excuse, get back to clearing plates where she was safe. But another part of her, a part that had been buried under long shifts and overdue bills and quiet exhaustion, began to stir. It was a cold, sharp feeling. Not anger, exactly. More like a decision. He thought this would embarrass her. He thought she would fumble through some simple song, maybe a clumsy children's tune, and confirm his belief that her past was just a sad little story. He was offering her up as a joke for his friends. A live demonstration of how the world really worked. She reached the piano. For a moment, she just stood beside the bench, her back to the room. She placed a hand lightly on the cool, smooth wood of its side. It felt familiar. It felt like an old friend she had been forced to abandon. The man's voice cut through the silence again, smooth and loud for the crowd. Don't be nervous now. We don't expect a masterpiece. Just a little something from the old days. A few people chuckled softly, politely. The tension broke for them, but for her, it coiled tighter. She didn't acknowledge him. She pulled out the piano bench and sat down. The leather sighed softly under her weight. She arranged the simple skirt of her uniform. She looked down at the keys, a sea of white and black. They were clean, perfect, untouched. She hadn't played a piano like this since the academy. The diner she worked in had an old, out-of-tune upright in the back for staff parties, its keys yellowed and sticky with soda spills. This was a different creature entirely. She let her hands rest in her lap for a moment. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath, blocking out the room, the lights, the watching people. She searched for a memory, not of music theory, not of practice rooms, but of a feeling. She thought of her grandmother's small, warm apartment, the smell of cinnamon and old books. She thought of the feeling she used to get when she played, a feeling of being somewhere else, of speaking a language without words. It was a feeling that had nothing to do with stages or scholarships or wealthy men in big houses. When she opened her eyes, the panic was gone. Her face was calm, settled. Her shoulders, which had been tied up by her ears, relaxed and dropped. Her spine straightened. It was a small change, but the people closest to the piano saw it. The woman who had been a nervous waitress a moment ago seemed to vanish. In her place sat someone else, someone focused and still. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keys. The man watched, his arms crossed. He was waiting for the first hesitant, stumbling note. He was ready to give a gracious, pitying smile to his guests when it happened. Her fingers descended. The first sound was not a melody. It was a single, low note from the left hand. It was deep and soft, like a distant bell underwater. It hung in the air, vibrating. Then another note, higher, from the right hand. A pure, clear tone. Then another, and another, not a tune yet, but a pattern, like drops of rain beginning to fall on a quiet pond dot. It was the beginning of a piece by Chopin. Not a famous, flashy one everyone would know, or one of the ballades. It started quietly, thoughtfully, almost like a question. The man's smirk faded a little. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't hesitant. This was intentional. Her left hand began a gentle, rocking rhythm, a foundation that was both steady and sad. Over it, her right hand started to weave a story. The notes were liquid, flowing one into the next. They rose in a gentle wave, then fell back, delicate and full of something that felt like longing. The room, which had been holding its breath in anticipation of a car crash, now held its breath for a different reason. The few whispered comments died completely. A woman who had been examining her nails in boredom looked up, her hand frozen in midair. A man holding a glass of whiskey forgot to take a sip. She played on. The music grew a little stronger, a little more sure. The simple questioning phrases began to build, gathering emotion. Her hands moved with an economy that spoke of years of practice, no wild, dramatic gestures, just precise, confident motion from the wrists and fingers. She leaned into the keys, her body feeling the music, not just playing it. She wasn't playing for them. She wasn't even playing at the man who had forced her into this. She was playing for that feeling. She was playing for the grandmother who had scrimped for her first lessons. She was playing for the girl who used to practice until her fingers ached, believing in the magic of it. She was playing for the long, quiet years in between, where the music had been locked away, silent but not dead. The melody unfolded, becoming more complex, more passionate. It swirled and danced, then pulled back into moments of heartbreaking softness. You could hear a storm in it, and a lullaby. You could hear a fight and a surrender. The guests were transfixed. This was no party trick. This was not background music. This was a performance, a real one. People began to look at each other, not with mocking smiles, but with wide eyes and slight shakes of the head, as if to say, Asterisk, can you believe this? Asterisk, the man, Damien, stood very still. The confident, amused posture was gone. His arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides. His face had lost all its color. He stared at her back, at her moving hands, as if seeing a ghost. This was not what was supposed to happen. The narrative had broken. The punchline had disappeared. He had meant to display a faded trophy, but he had instead opened a cage and set something wild and beautiful loose in his living room. He knew enough about music to know this wasn't just good. This was a level of skill that belonged in concert halls, not at cocktail parties. The technical control, the subtle shading of emotion in each phrase, it was masterful. And it was coming from the woman he had just tried to humiliate in front of everyone he knew. A deep, hot shame began to crawl up from his stomach. It mixed with a dawning, terrible understanding. He hadn't been clever. He had been a fool. He had provided the stage, the instrument, and the audience. And she was using them all to tell a story he suddenly didn't want to hear. The music built towards its first major climax. Her body leaned into the work, her back straight and strong. The notes came faster, louder, a rushing torrent of sound that filled the enormous room completely, leaving no space for anything else. It was powerful, it was tragic, it was glorious. And in the middle of that wave of sound, in the heart of his own home, The millionaire felt utterly, completely silent. The music didn't just stop. It ended. There was a final powerful chord that seemed to shake the crystals in the chandelier, and then a last, single, pure note that hung in the air like a drop of water before it falls. And then, silence, not the polite, waiting silence from before. This was a deep, stunned, and full silence. It was the quiet that happens when something too big for words has just taken place. For a long moment, no one moved. No one coughed. No one breathed too loudly. They were all still caught in the world the music had built, a world of stormy emotions and fragile beauty that felt more real than the fancy room around them. She lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest in her lap again. Her head was bowed slightly, her shoulders rising and falling with a slow, deep breath. The connection was broken. The spell was over. She was just a woman in a waitress uniform again, sitting at a giant piano. Then the room erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a burst of sound-clapping cheers, voices calling out, "Bravo!" And incredible. The noise was loud and warm and real. People who had been perfect, cool strangers minutes before were now smiling with genuine awe, their faces alive with excitement. A man with graying hair, a well-known music producer who had been bored all night, was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone, his eyes sharp and focused on her. A society columnist was frantically typing into her phone, her earlier story about the decor completely forgotten. She stood up from the bench. She turned to face the room, and for the first time, she really looked at them. She didn't smile a big, triumphant smile. She just gave a small, polite nod, a professional acknowledgement. It was the kind of bow a performer gives when the piece is about the music, not the performer. Then she stepped away from the piano. Her path back across the room was completely different. Before, people had parted to watch the spectacle. Now they pressed forward. Hands reached out to gently touch her arm. Voices surrounded her. That was breathtaking. "Where do you perform?" "I must hear you again." "Excuse me, miss, do you have representation?" She navigated through them with the same quiet efficiency she had used to navigate with her tray. She offered small nods, murmured a soft, "Thank you," but her eyes were looking past them. She walked straight back to the low table where she had left her tray of empty glasses. She picked it up. The weight of it, the feel of the smooth metal in her hands, was a shock. It felt crude and heavy after the lightness of the piano keys. She was putting the uniform back on, not physically, but in her mind. This was her job. The party wasn't over. There were still glasses to collect, dishes to clear, but the party had changed. The center of gravity had shifted. All eyes followed her as she moved towards the kitchen door. The conversation started up again, but they were all about her. "Who is she? Did you see Thorne's face? That was a professional performance if I've ever heard one." And where was the host? He was still standing in the same spot, near the piano. The applause had washed over him like a wave, leaving him cold and stranded. He felt exposed. The clever game he had set up had blown up in his face, and everyone had seen it. His guests weren't looking at him with admiration for his cleverness. They were looking past him, at her, with admiration for her talent. Some were glancing at him with pity, or worse, with a kind of quiet judgment. He watched her pick up that tray. The simple, ordinary act of it was like a slap. She wasn't basking in the applause. She was going back to work. In his mind, this only made it worse. It underscored the horrible miscalculation he had made. He had tried to highlight the difference between them, but he had only succeeded in highlighting something in her that his money could never buy. He knew he had to do something. He had to regain control, or at least try to save face. He put on his host's smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes, and started moving through the crowd towards her. He had to say something gracious. He had to make it seem like this was his gift to the party, a wonderful surprise he had arranged. He caught up to her, just as she was about to push through the swinging door to the kitchen. The noise from the party was a dull roar behind them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. She stopped and turned. She looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry or proud. It was blank, patient, the look of an employee waiting for an instruction from the boss. That blankness was somehow more devastating than any glare. "That was truly remarkable," he said, forcing the words out. "You have an extraordinary gift. I had no idea you had maintained such a high level of skill." He was floundering, and he knew it. She just looked at him, waiting. We are all very grateful you shared that with us," he continued. The words tasted like ash. "You've made the evening unforgettable." There was a pause. The sounds of the kitchen clattering pans, shouted orders leaked through the door. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, calm, and clear. "Will there be anything else, sir?" It was the most ordinary service industry phrase in the world. But in that moment, in that context, it was a dismissal. It drew a line. She was not a guest. She was not a performer he had hired. She was staff. And by returning to that role so completely, she was refusing to play any other part in his drama. She was refusing his fake compliment, his attempt to wrap the whole thing up as his successful party trick. She was saying, "You wanted a waitress? Here is your waitress." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? No, that will be all? He just stood there, his smile frozen and brittle. She gave that same small, polite nod she had given the crowd. Then she turned, pushed the door open with her shoulder, and disappeared into the bright, noisy chaos of the kitchen, leaving him alone in the elegant hallway. The door swung shut behind her, cutting off the light and the sound. He was left standing there, listening to the party he was supposedly hosting continue without him. He could hear his own name, her name, the word piano, floating in the chatter. He felt a hollow space open up inside his chest. He had wanted to prove that the world made sense, that money and position placed you safely above others. But for those few minutes, she had been untouchable. And all his money, his house, his party, had just been the backdrop for her to show him something he would never understand. Back in the kitchen, it was a different world. The heat was intense. Chefs in white jackets were calling out orders. Dishwashers steamed. For a second, the other waitstaff stopped and looked at her. They had heard the music faintly through the doors. They had heard the explosion of applause. They looked at her with new, curious eyes. But the head caterer, a practical woman with a clipboard, clapped her hands. "All right, people, focus. Dessert service in 5. We're not done yet." The spell was well and truly broken. She set her tray down at the washing station and took a deep breath, the smell of garlic and dish soap replacing gardenias. She rolled her shoulders. Her fingers, which had felt so alive and powerful, now ached dully, unused to such intense work. She looked at them. They were the same hands that had just played a masterpiece. Now they were about to start clearing plates of half-eaten chocolate torte. A part of her wanted to scream or laugh or cry. But another, stronger part felt a quiet, solid calm. For the first time in a very long time, she had remembered who she was. Not a waitress. Not a former student. But someone who could speak in a language of notes and feelings that could stop a room cold. That person was still there. She had just been sleeping. She picked up a fresh tray and headed back towards the door, back to the party. The work was still there. The bills were still there. But something had shifted. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. But tonight, for a few minutes, she had been free. And no one, not even the man in the expensive suit, could ever take that away from her. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, but it couldn't shut out the feeling of the night. The air was thick with steam and the sharp scent of disinfectant. The roar of the party was now a muffled hum, like traffic heard from far away. For a second, she just stood there, letting the reality of the kitchen walls close in around her. Her heart was still beating a little too fast, and her fingertips tingled. The other servers were a blur of motion, but a few shot her glances quick. Curious looks that held questions she didn't have the energy to answer. The head caterer, a woman with a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing, pointed a finger at a rack of delicate dessert plates. "You're on the East Room. Go, keep it moving. Party's not over." And just like that, she was back. She loaded her tray with plates holding tiny, perfect fruit tarts and glasses of sparkling dessert wine. The wait was familiar, the routine a script she knew by heart. She pushed back through the door. The party noise washed over her again, but it was different now. Before, the chatter had been a wall of sound she moved around. Now it seemed to part for her. Conversations dipped as she passed. Heads turned not to order a drink, but to look at her, to whisper. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the path to her assigned room. The clink of glass on her tray, the only sound she wanted to hear dot in the East Room. A smaller, library-like space, the atmosphere was even more charged. The guests here had missed the performance live, but they'd heard all about it. A woman in a silver dress touched her husband's arm as she walked in. "That's her," she murmured, not even trying to hide it. She went about her work, offering the desserts with a soft, "Would you care for a tart?" But no one was interested in the food. The man with the graying hair, the music producer, was there. He had followed her. He intercepted her as she tried to move past a bookshelf. He didn't grab her, but he stepped smoothly into her path. His expression was no longer one of bored politeness. It was sharp, focused, like a businessman who has spotted a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "Please," he said, his voice low but intense. "Just 30 seconds." He held up a business card between two fingers. It was simple, thick white paper with embossed black lettering. "My name is not important right now. What is important is that what happened out there was criminal. A talent like yours should not be hidden." She stopped, tray balanced on one hand. She didn't reach for the card. "I have a studio," he continued, his words quick and quiet. "We record artists, real artists. I want you to come in. Next week, tomorrow, just to play. No strings. Just let me hear you in a proper setting." That wasn't a party trick. That was a buried treasure. He gestured around the opulent room. This is not where you belong. You know it. I know it." He wasn't being kind. He was being honest, and there was a thrilling, frightening urgency in his honesty. He was looking at her like she was a missing masterpiece he'd just found in a dusty attic. Before she could react, another person appeared at her elbow. It was the society columnist, her phone still in her hand. "I'm writing about tonight for the Morning Digest," she said, her voice a practiced blend of warmth and purpose. "I'd love just a few words from you. Your name? Where you trained? How does it feel to have a moment like that here, of all places?" The woman's eyes were bright, not with malice, but with the gleam of a perfect story. She was surrounded. The tray in her hands felt like a shield, and a ridiculous one. These people weren't seeing a waitress anymore. They were seeing the person from the piano. They were offering a different script, one she had thrown away years ago. "I'm working," she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt. It was the only safe thing to say. The producer nodded, understanding but undeterred. He gently slid his card onto the corner of her tray, right beside empty champagne flute. Take it. Think about it. Call any time. Then he melted back into the crowd. Knowing when to retreat, the columnist opened her mouth to push further, but a sharp look from the head caterer, who had appeared in the doorway with a hawk-like gaze, made her back off with a tight smile. Later, perhaps, she said, and drifted away. She finished passing the desserts in a daze. Her mind was spinning. The producer's words echoed. Buried treasure. Criminal. They felt too big, too loud. For years, her life had been about small things. Making enough for rent. Enduring a rude customer. Getting through the shift. The dream of music had become a quiet, private hurt. A ghost that lived in the back of her mind. To have it dragged out into this bright light. To be called a treasure. It was overwhelming. She went back to the kitchen, her tray empty. This time, the other servers didn't just glance. A young woman who was polishing wine glasses leaned over. Hey, that was really cool what you did out there. The words were simple, but the tone was pure solidarity. One worker to another. She managed a small, tired smile. Thanks. She was sent back out to collect empty glasses. The party was winding down now. The laughter was louder, looser. Clusters of guests were by the doors, calling for their cars. As she moved through the grand living room, she saw him again. The host was by the fireplace, talking to a small group. He was trying to hold court, to be the center of his own party again. He was telling a story, his hands moving, forcing a laugh. But his eyes were darting around the room. They looked tired. The guests with him were nodding, but their attention was thin, pulled away by their own conversations about the incredible waitress performance. His gaze landed on her as she collected a cluster of glasses from a side table. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was no smirk now, no challenge. What she saw looked a lot like confusion, and beneath that, something like shame. He looked away first, turning back to his friends with a little too much enthusiasm. She felt no victory in that look. It just felt sad. The whole thing felt sad. This big, beautiful, empty house. The people in their expensive clothes, so easily thrilled and then moving on. The man who had everything but felt the need to pick at someone he thought had less. She finished her round. The head caterer announced the staff could begin the breakdown. The hardest part of the night began clearing the debris of the party. Stripping tablecloths, stacking chairs, hauling bags of trash out the service entrance. As she was carrying a heavy bin of bottles out into the cool night air. The back alley dark and lined with dumpsters. The producer found her one last time. He was pulling on a coat, about to leave. I meant what I said, he told her, his breath making a small cloud in the air. Don't let this moment be the end of the story. Let it be the beginning. He nodded toward the service door. That in there, that's a job. What you did at the piano, that's a life. Don't confuse the two. He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and walked toward the front of the house, where the valets were bringing around luxury cars. She stood there for a minute in the quiet dark, the smell of garbage and night air around her. She pulled the thick white business card from her apron pocket. In the dim light from a security bulb, she could just make out his name and a phone number. It felt solid, real. Back inside, as she was helping wipe down the now bare kitchen counters, the head caterer handed her an envelope. Her pay for the night. It was cash, more than she made in a week at the diner. It felt heavy too. The caterer looked at her for a long moment. You know, the woman said, her voice losing its professional bark for just a second. I've worked a lot of these things. I've seen a lot of performances. She shrugged. That was something else. Don't spend your whole life clearing other people's plates, kid. Finally, it was over. She changed out of her uniform in a cramped staff bathroom, back into her own simple jeans and sweater. She folded the uniform neatly, left it in the designated basket, and walked out the service entrance for the last time. The night was completely quiet now. The last of the cars were gone. The big house was just a dark shape against the starry sky, its windows black. She walked to the bus stop, the envelope of cash and the business card both in her bag. She sat on the cold bench, waiting. She thought about the feeling of the piano keys, the way the room had disappeared. She thought about the producer's intense eyes. She thought about the host's confused, ashamed face. Mostly, she thought about the quiet that had come after the music ended. Not the silence of the guests, but the quiet inside herself. A peace she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about remembering something right. She had a gift. It hadn't died. It had just been waiting. The bus arrived with a sigh of air brakes and a glow of yellow light. The doors opened. She climbed on, paid her fare, and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the shrinking silhouette of the mansion. She didn't feel like she was leaving a scene of triumph. She felt like she was finally going home, even though she wasn't sure where that was yet. But for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like a beginning, waiting for her to find the first note. The bus ride home was a world away from the mansion. The rattling engine and the fluorescent lights overhead replaced the soft music and crystal chandeliers. The other passengers were tired people heading to night shifts or coming from them, lost in their own thoughts. She leaned her head against the cool window, watching the dark neighborhoods blur past. The envelope of cash in her bag felt like a brick, a solid reminder of the night. The business card felt like a spark, tiny and dangerous. For a few days, nothing changed. She went back to her normal life. The diner, the smell of old coffee and grease, the familiar clatter of dishes. She poured refills, took orders for meatloaf specials, and smiled at the regulars. The world kept turning. The rent got paid, a little easier this time. She bought some groceries that weren't just the cheapest option. Small victories. But something inside her had been shaken loose. It was like she had been living in a black and white room, and someone had suddenly opened a door to a world in color. She couldn't unsee it. She found herself listening to the music on the diner's old radio differently. She'd hear a piece of classical music used in a commercial, and her fingers would twitch on the handle of the coffee pot, remembering the shapes of the chords. The business card sat on her small kitchen table. She moved it around, sometimes putting it in a drawer, only to take it out again. She looked up the producer's name. He was real, very real. He'd worked with musicians she respected. It wasn't a trick. Fear held her back. A deep, cold fear. What if she went to the studio and it was a fluke? What if the magic of that night at the party was just a strange moment of pressure and adrenaline, and in the cold light of day, she was just okay? What if she opened that door to the colorful world and found it was just another closed room? The disappointment might be worse than never trying at all. About a week passed. Then, on her day off, she found herself putting on her cleanest clothes and getting on a bus heading downtown, not to the diner, but to an address she'd memorized. She didn't call first. She thought if she called, she'd chicken out. She just went. The studio was in a plain brick building, nothing fancy. Inside, it was a hive of quiet activity. A young man at a reception desk looked up. "Can I help you?" She almost turned around. Instead, she said, "I'm here to see," and she said the producer's name. Her voice sounded small. The man nodded, unsurprised. "He's in Studio B, down the hall, to the left." She walked down a carpeted hallway, lined with gold and platinum records on the walls. She could hear the faint thump of a bass line from behind one door. She found the door marked B and knocked softly. The producer opened it. He was wearing glasses and holding a tablet. For a second, he didn't recognize her, his mind on his work. Then his eyes focused. A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't the host's smug smile. It was a smile of genuine pleasure. "You came," he said, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "Come in." The studio was a cocoon. Soft lights, soundproofing on the walls. And in the center, a beautiful, well-loved grand piano. It wasn't as shiny as the one in the mansion, but it looked real, played in. I didn't call," she started. "Better," he interrupted, waving a hand. "No time to get nervous. This is just a room. That's just an instrument." He pointed to a chair in the corner. "I'll be over here, doing some work. You play or don't play. Just get used to the space. No one is watching." Then he sat down, put on headphones, and started looking at his tablet, deliberately giving her the room. It was the kindest thing anyone could have done. He wasn't making it a test. He was giving her back her music. She sat at the piano. She touched the keys. They felt different, softer, with more character. She played a few scales, her fingers stiff at first. The sound in the quiet, perfect room was immense and clear. It startled her. She played a simple piece she'd learned as a child, something with no stakes. The notes filled the space, honest and plain. She forgot he was there. She forgot the party, the diner, the bus. She started to play the Chopin ballade again, but slower this time, feeling her way. She hit a wrong note, winced, and kept going. She played a section, stopped, went back. This wasn't a performance. This was a conversation. With the piano. With herself. She didn't know how long she played. It could have been 20 minutes or an hour. When she finally stopped, her hands resting in her lap, the silence of the studio felt warm and full, not empty. The producer had taken his headphones off. He was just watching her, his chin resting on his hand. He didn't clap. He just nodded. "The technique is rusty," he said matter-of-factly. "That's to be expected. It's just mechanics. We can fix that with practice." He leaned forward. "But the other thing, the thing that makes people stop talking and listen, that's all still there. It's maybe even stronger now. You've lived a little. It comes out in the music." He stood up and walked over. "I'm not offering you a record deal. Not yet. I'm offering you work. Hard work. You'll practice here on this piano 3 times a week to start. You'll get your chops back. You'll learn new repertoire. I'll coach you. In return, you'll help out here at the studio some filing, answering phones, whatever needs doing. It won't pay much at first. Certainly less than tips at a busy diner." He looked her straight in the eye. "I'm offering you a foot in the door. The rest is up to you. It's a gamble. You'll be poor and tired for a while longer. But you'll be a musician again. What do you say?" She looked around the quiet studio. She looked at her hands. She thought of the endless, predictable cycle of the diner. Then she thought of the impossible, frightening, beautiful unknown of this path. "Yes," she said. The word was barely a whisper, but it was the most certain sound she'd made in years. Asterisk, 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 asterisk months later. The host of the party, the man in the big house, was having lunch at a quiet, expensive restaurant downtown. He was meeting a potential investor. As they talked, his eyes drifted to a small, elegant poster framed near the entrance. It advertised an upcoming series of lunchtime recitals at the city's arts center. "Rising Stars," it said. One name caught his eye. It was hers. Her full name, the one he'd never bothered to learn that night. She was scheduled to play a program of Chopin and Debussy. He stared at it. A strange feeling settled in his chest, not jealousy. Exactly. It was more like a quiet, humbling understanding. He had tried to put her in a small box labeled waitress. He had failed. She had not only stepped out of that box, she had built a stage from its pieces. He pointed to the poster, interrupting the investor's talk about market shares. "I know her," he said, his voice oddly quiet. "Oh?" The investor said, impressed. "She's getting wonderful buzz. They say she has an incredible story. Came out of nowhere." He just nodded. "Yes," he said finally. "She does." He didn't go to the recital. It didn't feel like his place. But he thought about it on that day, at that time. He imagined the small, sunlit hall. He imagined her walking out, not in a uniform, but in a simple black dress. He imagined her sitting at the piano, taking that same deep breath. He imagined the first notes filling a room where people had come just to listen, not to eat or drink or be seen out, and in that moment, in his fancy restaurant, he finally heard the real end of the story that had started in his living room. It wasn't about his shame or her triumph over him. That was just a small, ugly moment in the middle. The real story was about a woman and a piano. It was about a gift that refused to die, even when it was buried under long hours and hard luck. It was about the courage to answer a call, even when your hands are shaking. He had been a footnote in that story, a catalyst. The story itself was so much bigger than him. He paid the lunch bill, a generous tip included. As he walked out, he gave the poster one last look. This time, he felt something almost like gratitude. She had, without ever meaning to, taught him something. She had shown him that real value can't be displayed on a balance sheet, and that dignity can't be taken away by someone else. It can only be given up by you. He walked out into the afternoon sun. Somewhere across town, in a modest studio, a woman was practicing. The same fierce concentration was on her face. A scale, repeated, perfected. A difficult passage, broken down note by note. The work was humble and hard. It was the sound of a dream being rebuilt, not with glitter and champagne, but with patience, one note at a time. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world.